Miss Marple had learned that crimes often hid behind the most ordinary of objects. This time, a single velvet button would unlock a tale of lies, betrayal, and quiet revenge. Chapter 1. The Velvet Button at the Vicarage Garden. The annual garden fete in St. Clement's Green had always been a subdued affair, embroidered tea cloths fluttering under elm trees, sponge cakes judged with terrifying precision by the Women's Institute, and elderly men pretending not to doze beneath striped marquees. But this year, something was different, not because of the perfectly sunny weather, nor the fact that the bishop himself had promised to attend for precisely 17 minutes, but because of a velvet button. Miss Marple noticed it first, not in a dramatic fashion, of course. She was merely arranging the raffle tickets on the vicarage lawn table, when her fingers brushed against something soft beneath the bench. A peculiar thing, a deep crimson button, soft to the touch, crushed as if recently torn from clothing. It seemed oddly out of place amidst the rustic English charm of bunting and lemon drizzle. She held it up briefly to the sunlight, inspecting the faint gold thread around the edge. "That's not from anything home-sewn," she murmured to herself, placing it gently on a napkin and tucking it into her handbag. Years of village living had taught her that peculiar things had a way of returning, quite insistently, to their rightful context. At precisely 2 minutes past 3, the fete was interrupted. A shriek, sharp and unnatural, echoed from the vicarage's side garden, where the climbing roses grew thick along the trellis. The voice belonged to Mrs. Isabel Ardingly, a retired headmistress whose presence always guaranteed an air of genteel severity. Her head had fallen askew, and her eyes, usually as firm as boiled sweets, were wide with horror. "They must come quickly," she cried, pointing toward the rose bushes. There's someone dead." The crowd gathered, reluctant yet irresistibly drawn, around the narrow path that led toward the vicar's potting shed. The air was perfumed with lavender and tension, and there, beneath the sunlit tangle of roses, lay a man no one had expected to see again, Mr. Lionel Blackwood. His jacket was soaked at the shoulder with what appeared to be blood, and his head was twisted at an unnatural angle, as though his final expression had been one of reluctant surprise. On his lapel, notably missing, was a button. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the back, said nothing. Her gloved hands remained folded, but her eyes had narrowed almost imperceptibly. Blackwood, a solicitor from Chipping Thatcham, had only recently reappeared in village life. His absence of over a decade had been the source of gentle gossip and sharp conjecture. He'd once been engaged, or so it was whispered, to a young woman from the village who had left under mysterious circumstances. Since his return, he had kept mostly to himself, though Miss Hartnell from the post office had mentioned he'd been making inquiries, delicate ones, about certain papers and such. "Must have been a heart attack," said Reverend Puckle, bending with difficulty over the body, "or perhaps a stroke." "There's blood, Vicar," said Constable Timms, who had arrived rather breathless, a half-eaten scone still in his hand. "Heart attacks don't usually bleed, do they?" "Well, I suppose not," the vicar stammered, straightening up and looking vaguely toward Miss Marple, who was already retreating from the crowd. The constable, young and eager, was quick to take charge. "Right then, nobody leave the premises. I'll telephone Inspector Cray from Market Ledbury." He turned to Miss Marple. "You didn't happen to see anything odd, did you, Miss Marple?" "Oh no," she replied with gentle certainty. "But one does wonder why a man who arrived alone might have a velvet button missing from his coat, and rose thorns upon his back. So easy to slip, of course, but not if you were facing the garden gate, I think." Timms blinked. "You saw him come in?" "No," she said, adjusting her shawl. "But I imagine someone did. Someone always does, and they usually don't realize what they've seen until much later. Poor dear Mrs. Ardingly, for instance, she always walks the rose path precisely at 3 o'clock, just after she's had her barley water, The young constable made a mental note. He would have preferred something simpler like a good, clean burglary butt in St. Clement's Green. Nothing was ever so straightforward. By 3:30, the fete had been thoroughly cancelled, the bishop discreetly ushered away with apologies, and the villagers had retreated into private huddles of speculation. Cups of tea were brewed with trembling fingers, and the bunting, still swaying in the breeze, looked oddly festive above the sight of sudden death. Miss Marple returned to her cottage at Daneswood Lane with a steady step. She removed the button from her handbag and placed it upon her sewing table. It was quite unremarkable, really, except that it was velvet, and men like Mr. Blackwood did not wear velvet, and certainly not velvet that smelt faintly of lavender and lilac soap. Chapter 2. The Weight of Whispers. By early evening, the news had folded itself into every teacup and hearthside. Conversation across St. Clement's Green, the tragic end of Mr. Lionel Blackwood, was no longer merely the subject of curiosity. It had become a kind of village rite. Each inhabitant, whether present at the fete or not, now held a version of the story, embroidered with suspicion and stitched tight with speculation. In the parlor of the vicarage, Reverend Puckle sat with his spectacles askew, poring over his sermon notes and failing to ignore the flurry of voices outside his window. The garden that had, only hours before, hosted spiced buns and a charity tombola, now held the haunted hush of an interrupted narrative. Constable Timms stood near the trellis where the body had been discovered, clumsily noting down footprints and asking pointed questions about shrubbery patterns. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly in her own drawing room, the ticking of the grandfather clock marking time with gentle insistence. She was not one to involve herself prematurely, not in words, at least, but her mind moved swiftly behind the composed expression, sorting through impressions as one might gently untangle fine embroidery floss. She had known Lionel Blackwood, not well, but well enough to remember the way he used to hum under his breath when he read notices at the parish hall, a solitary man, even before his departure. And when he had returned 3 weeks ago, there had been no grand announcement, just a glimpse of him outside the draper's, a murmured hello near the chemist, a shadow on the church pews during evensong. The village, naturally, had begun its gossip the moment his name reappeared. Back for the will, no doubt, said Miss Hartnell with a tight-lipped nod. Never a man to stay where things got complicated. I heard he was seeking forgiveness. Mrs. Tuffin chimed in over her garden gate. Old sins, you know. Can't bury those forever. Miss Marple knew better than to take such talk as truth, but she also knew that gossip, like weeds, had roots somewhere. That evening, Inspector Cray arrived from Market Ledbury, with his familiar gait trigid with purpose and slightly too loud for village sensibilities. He was not a cruel man, nor an incompetent one, but he had little time for the delicate webs spun beneath the surface of a place. Like St. Clement's Green, the wound appears blunt, he declared to the assembled onlookers near the potting shed. A blow to the back of the head, no weapon yet found, though likely something heavy, perhaps a gardening tool. Mrs. Ardingly, who had insisted on being useful, offered a watering can and 3 suspect trowels for inspection, and nothing was taken. Cray asked, flipping through his notebook. No wallet missing, Timms confirmed. No jewelry, but a button. Inspector C here might have come from his coat. He produced the remaining buttons. Dull black, one hanging by a thread, while the topmost, where one might expect a finer fastener, was conspicuously absent. Cray made a grunt of acknowledgement. Looks expensive, this coat. Tailored, but hardly the sort to wear a velvet button. Timms nodded. Miss Marple found one earlier, sir. Crimson velvet. Said it seemed out of place. Cray's expression stiffened. Did she now? When he later visited her cottage, Miss Marple greeted him with her usual calm. Tea, Inspector. No time for tea, Miss Marple. Just the facts today, if you don't mind. Ah, she said gently, placing the teapot down. And yet it's often the absence of facts that misleads. He eyed her warily. You found a button? Yes, on the bench near the raffle table. Here it is. She handed it to him in a folded napkin, without ceremony. Cray examined it. Not from Blackwood's jacket. I rather thought not, she replied. To refined, wouldn't you say? And scented faintly lavender and lilac, as if worn by someone who prefers perfumes more than pipe smoke. Cray frowned. You think it belonged to a woman? I merely think it didn't belong to Mr. Blackwood, she said, with that infuriatingly mild tone that made Cray feel as though he were being corrected. Without having said a word wrong, back at the vicarage, Mrs. Weatherby was volunteering herself as a witness, though not of the crime, but of the circumstances that must surely surround it. He looked troubled. That's what I'll say, she said, perched on the edge of a garden chair as if ready to leap into recollection. 3 days ago I saw him pacing outside the parish library, back and forth, muttering to himself. And when he saw me, he stopped at once and looked pale as a bedsheet. What time of day? Cray asked. 11ish, just after the post had come. Miss Marple, still sipping her now cold tea at home, considered the oddness of it. Why would a man return after 10 years of silence, speak to no one of substance, and then die on a rose path during a village fete? Had he come to confess something, reclaim something, or merely unsettle those who had tried so hard to forget? By morning, word had spread that the Blackwood inheritance was being contested in Chipping Thatcham, an old case, but recently revived. Some said it had to do with land, others with missing documents, but all agreed it was the sort of thing that could sour even a saint. Miss Marple was inclined to believe that Mr. Blackwood's return had stirred more than legal papers. She walked through the village that day, with her parasol in hand, pausing outside the house of Mrs. Amelia Wrexham, a widow known for her porcelain collection and solitary habits. Years ago, Amelia's niece had been engaged to Lionel, or so it had been whispered. The niece had vanished shortly after. Gone to America, they had said, though Miss Marple had always doubted the geography. As she stood before the iron gate, Miss Marple noticed something curious: an overturned flower pot beside the path, freshly broken, and a small smear of red along the stone edge, not blood, lipstick. She stepped back and continued on her way, saying nothing. But later, as she adjusted her embroidery hoop, she murmured, almost to herself, velvet buttons, lavender perfume, and red lipstick. Not a combination one finds in the solicitor's wardrobe. Outside, the wind rattled the hedgerows gently, as though urging the leaves to gossip. And the village obliged. Chapter 3, Lavender and Lies. By Tuesday morning, the velvet button had become a subject of fascination in parlor rooms and grocers' queues alike. To the villagers of St. Clement's Green, it was more than fabric, it was theater. A crimson flourish in an otherwise dull murder. Who, they wondered aloud, wore velvet in June? Who walked through the vicarage garden with lilac perfume on their coat and blood on their conscience? At the heart of the speculation stood Amelia Wrexham's house, its blinds drawn tight against the summer light. Once the envy of the village with its iron lacework and geranium-filled boxes, the house now had a haunted stillness. Mrs. Wrexham had not been seen since the fete, and that in itself was cause for murmuring. She's delicate, claimed Mrs. Tuffin, with a knowing sniff over her tins at the grocer's. Always was. Never got over that niece of hers. What was her name? Cecilia? The one who disappeared just before she was meant to marry Blackwood. It was Cecily, corrected Miss Hartnell, who prided herself on her memory of other people's business. And she didn't disappear. She went abroad. Italy, I think. Or was it Canada? Vanished without a forwarding address is what she did. said Mr. Plumlow the butcher, thumbing a rind of bacon. "Not natural, if you ask me, Miss Marple." Seated quietly beside the post office that morning as she wrote a letter to her nephew Raymond, observed the conversation with her usual benign expression. She'd learned that the best way to listen was to remain completely unremarkable. By midday, Inspector Cray had returned from Chipping Thatcham with news that added fuel to the fire. Blackwood had recently contacted the registry. He informed Constable Timms in the shade of the churchyard, looking for documentation on an unfiled will, supposedly penned before his fiancée's departure. "Rumor is the document never surfaced, and the fiancée?" asked Timms. "No trace of her. No marriage. No records after 1939. Timms scratched his head. "Could she be dead, hiding, paid to disappear?" "All plausible," Cray replied. "But until I see a body or a passport, it's hearsay." Miss Marple, walking past them just then with a small bag of thread and barley sweets, tilted her head slightly. "Sometimes," she offered, "people do not vanish at all. They simply change the shape of their silence." Cray turned, half annoyed, half intrigued. "Come again, Miss Marple?" But she only smiled. "Just a thought. Now, do excuse me, I am late for tea with Mrs. Wrexham." The inspector blinked. "You're calling on her?" "Well, she is my bridge partner on Thursdays," said Miss Marple lightly. "And besides, a lady who hasn't opened her curtains in 3 days is either unwell or pretending." She set off down Daneswood Lane, a figure both quaint and quietly determined, her steps slow but unwavering. When she reached the Wrexham house, she knocked gently not once, but twice, a pause between. After a moment, the door creaked open. Amelia Wrexham stood there in a faded blue housecoat, her eyes red-rimmed, the faintest scent of lavender lingering in the hallway behind her. "Jane," she said flatly, "I wasn't expecting." "Oh, I won't stay long," said Miss Marple kindly, stepping inside. "I only thought you might like some lemon barley and company." "No one likes grief in isolation." Amelia hesitated, then led her into the sitting room. The curtains were drawn, but the faint light revealed a room once elegant, now slightly faded doilies askew, a cracked teacup on the side table, and an open letter beside a bottle of smelling salts. "I heard about Lionel," she said finally. "Terrible business. I suppose you've come to ask about him." "Not directly," Miss Marple said, setting her basket down. "But one always wonders, in cases such as these, what truly brings a man back after so long." Amelia looked away. "Guilt, perhaps, or hope," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Hope to mend something left unfinished." Amelia did not respond at first. Then, with a sudden, brittle honesty, she said, "He wrote to me a month ago. Said he wanted to make peace. But it was too late. Much too late." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he mention Cecily?" A sharp intake of breath. "No," Amelia said at last. "But I imagine that's what he meant." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the button, wrapped again in the same napkin. "This was found under the bench at the fete," she said softly. "It doesn't belong to Lionel's coat." Amelia's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for it, but then she stopped. "I don't wear velvet," she said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But Cecily did, if memory serves." A long silence followed. Then Amelia Wrexham, with a strange steadiness, stood and walked to a small drawer beneath the writing desk. She withdrew an envelope, aged and yellowed, and handed it to Miss Marple. It arrived 4 days ago. No return address. No signature. Just this. Inside was a single folded page-thick ivory paper with faded blue ink. The message was brief. "You always told me to wait until I was no longer afraid. I think the time has come. You'll know me by the red button." C. Miss Marple read it twice, then looked up, her face unreadable. "You didn't show this to the police?" Amelia lowered herself onto the sofa. How could I? I didn't want them digging again. Lionel was the one who ruined her, not the other way around. She was pregnant, wasn't she? A nod. Miss Marple folded the letter. And you helped her leave. She begged me not to tell. Said he'd never let her go if he knew. Miss Marple rose slowly, returning the note to its envelope. It seems, then, that someone wanted Lionel to know she had returned, or at least to fear it. Outside, the air hung thick with birdsong and heat, but inside, the house seemed colder than it had been. Before she left, Miss Marple glanced at the bookshelf behind Amelia's armchair. A single volume leaned slightly, its spine bearing a name she hadn't heard in years, Cecily Wrexham, Selected Poems. Did she ever publish these? She asked quietly. No, Amelia said, her voice a whisper. Just one vanity print. Before she left, Miss Marple's fingers grazed the spine. She did not open it. She simply nodded and stepped back. Thank you for the barley, Amelia said distantly. And thank you, Miss Marple replied, for the truth, what little we still have of it. As she walked down the lane, the red velvet button nestled once again in her bag. Miss Marple's mind stirred with new questions. Had Cecily truly returned, or had someone used her memory like a weapon? The letter, the lipstick, the perfume, it was all too vivid, too pointed. Someone wanted to be noticed, but not too soon. Chapter 4. A whiff of paint and paper. By Wednesday, the rhythm of village life had begun to falter beneath the strain of curiosity. The murder had not faded like an unpleasant memory, as most in St. Clement's Green had hoped. Instead, it hovered, an unfinished sentence no one dared complete, with no arrest, no weapon, and now the whisper of a mysterious return from the past. The village turned inward. Conversations grew cautious. Glances lingered longer. Even the birdsong seemed oddly subdued. Miss Marple spent the morning in her garden, pruning the hydrangeas, while her mind, far removed from petals and stems, wandered through a maze of recollections. She thought again of the red velvet button, of Cecily's letter, and of the lipstick smear on Amelia's garden path. Symbols, not proofs, but symbols, were what the human soul left behind when it believed no one was watching. At 11:10, a soft knock on her back gate interrupted her reverie. Miss Hartnell peered through the slats with visible urgency. Jane, have you heard? Young Edward Plumley, yes. The butcher's son says he saw someone leaving the old painter's shed last night. Miss Marple dusted her gloves. The painter's shed? You mean Mr. Eldred's? Miss Hartnell nodded rapidly. Yes, the one behind the vicarage, just past the hedgerow. Boarded up for years. Edward swears someone lit a lamp inside. Said he saw it flicker through the cracks. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her voice sharpened slightly. What time? Just past midnight, he says. Thought it was a ghost at first. Edward thinks many things are ghosts, Miss Marple replied, stepping through the gate. But still, it would be unkind not to check. They parted at the lane. Miss Marple, now armed with her parasol and a growing sense of unease, made her way through the churchyard path toward the old painter's shed. Eldred, the former village portraitist, had died nearly 7 years ago, leaving behind dozens of unfinished canvases and a shed that no one quite dared repurpose. The structure was modest peeling green paint, ivy-clad, with a rusting padlock dangling uselessly from the door. Miss Marple tested the latch. It gave with a soft click. Inside, the shed smelled faintly of turpentine, mildew, and something else fresher. Paper? No, not paper. Parchment and perfume. She stepped in carefully. Dust motes spun through the shafts of morning light like dancers trapped in amber. Against the far wall stood an easel. Upon it rested a canvas, new, unsigned, and incomplete. It was a portrait, not finished, but unmistakably begun. A woman, her face blurred in outline, but her features hinted at something both familiar and haunting. Red lips, pale cheek, the faint impression of a velvet collar at the base of her throat. Miss Marple inhaled. She scanned the small room, noting a pile of old boxes in the corner, one of which had been recently opened. Inside were sketches, charcoal studies of hands, eyes, and most strikingly, of a woman seated by a window with her head turned slightly. In every image, the woman wore the same expression, unreadable. Tucked beneath one sketch was a monogrammed handkerchief. She unfolded it delicately, CW embroidered in navy thread. Curious, she murmured. She turned at the sound of movement behind her. It was Reverend Puckle, holding his hat in one hand and an expression of guilt in the other. Miss Marple, I thought I saw someone enter. I do hope I haven't startled you. Not at all, Vicar, she said. You've arrived at just the right moment. I wonder, has anyone else used this shed since Mr. Eldred passed? No, he said quickly. No one's touched it. In fact, I was meaning to have it cleared, but then there was. Well, all this, he gestured vaguely, encompassing Lionel Blackwood's death, the village's unease, and perhaps even the weather. Miss Marple held up the handkerchief. Do you recall Cecily Wrexham attending services here before she left? Puckle blinked. Yes, very quiet girl. Fond of poetry, if I remember correctly. She used to leave anonymous verses in the hymn books. Did she paint? Not that I knew of. Miss Marple looked again at the portrait. Then someone else has been trying to remember her, or revive her, back at the station. Inspector Cray frowned as he examined the sketches Miss Marple had delivered to him. In a neat manila folder, found in a shed behind the church, you say? Yes, said Miss Marple, calmly seated across from him. Alongside a monogrammed handkerchief and a half-finished painting, Cray tapped the folder. This complicates things, not if you consider the possibility, she replied, that someone is using Cecily's name and image as a disguise. Cray's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting an impersonation? Or a performance, she replied. Someone wanted Lionel Blackwood to believe that a ghost had returned to haunt him. And now that ghost has become flesh, or at least illusion. He rubbed his chin. But to what end? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is what we must discover, Inspector. And quickly, that afternoon, Constable Timms quietly followed up on a new report from the village innkeeper. A woman had checked in under the name Clara Withers, an alias, it turned out, with no address, no luggage, and no intention to stay. She had vanished by morning, leaving behind only the scent of lavender and a discarded theater program. The program, now smoothed flat on Cray's desk, bore the title of a recent West End play, The Ghost of Her Former Self. One of the cast was a young actress named Cecilia Warren. Miss Marple, upon seeing the photo, let out a very quiet ah. Not our Cecily, I suppose? Cray asked. No, she said, but someone clever enough to use a name close enough to stir memory, and a face similar enough to haunt it. Then who was she? He asked. Miss Marple looked down at the red velvet button, now pinned to a card in the evidence tray. That, Inspector, she said, is what I intend to find out, outside the window. The village carried on slower, more watchful. Curtains twitched, letters were opened with a second thought, and someone, somewhere in St. Clement's Green, was waiting to see what the next move would be. Chapter 5. The Actress in the Mirror. That evening, a soft mist settled over St. Clement's Green, blurring the lamplight and smudging the silhouettes of hedges and chimneys into ghostly shapes. The village had always embraced quiet, but now the quiet seemed to press too hard. As though listening, Miss Marple sat by the fireplace in her drawing room, knitting needles motionless in her lap. A single log crackled, casting flickering shadows across the wallpaper of roses and ivy. On the table beside her sat the theater program Inspector Cray had handed her hours before. Its glossy pages had worn soft at the edges from frequent handling. She had turned it over a dozen times already, studying the photograph of the young actress. Cecilia Warren. It was not Cecily Wrexham, but it was someone who knew of her or someone who had been instructed to become her. Miss Marple could not help recalling a phrase from her youth, murmured by a long-dead aunt who had once taught elocution. All theater is a kind of lie, dressed as a truth, but here, the lie had stepped off the stage and into the vicarage garden. Wrapped in lavender and a red velvet button, she rose and reached for her address book, her fingers quick despite the stiffness in her knuckles. She turned to the W's and located a penciled entry, Evangeline Westbrook, an old acquaintance from her days in Cheltenham. Miss Westbrook had once been a drama teacher at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and now, so Miss Marple believed, ran a modest talent agency for promising but undiscovered actresses. By 8 o'clock, she had dictated a note requesting information on one Miss Cecilia Warren. By 8:30, she had handed it to young Thomas, the paper boy, with a sixpence and instructions to take it straight to the Evening Post. No dawdling, she'd said firmly. This concerns a theatrical emergency. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray and Constable Timms sat in the back room of the station, a map of St. Clement's Green spread before them, peppered with pins and scribbled notes. Cray was growing increasingly frustrated. "We have a man dead with no witnesses to the act," he said, tapping the rose path with his pen. "We have an alleged former fiancé who may or may not have returned under a false identity. We have sketches, buttons, and now an actress who disappears from the inn like a ghost. She left something else behind," said Timms quietly. "I didn't mention it earlier because it seemed, well, almost too odd." Cray raised an eyebrow. "What? A compact mirror," Timms said. He pulled it from an evidence bag. "Silver. The initials CW are scratched on the inside, not engraved. Mind you, scratched, like someone made it look old on purpose." Cray examined it. "Could be a plant." Timms nodded. "Exactly." Cray leaned back in his chair. "Which means someone wants us to believe Cecily came back." Timms hesitated. "What if she did?" Cray stared at the map in silence. By Thursday morning, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. Cream envelope, thick paper, the kind one associates with well-mannered rejection or heartfelt confessions. She opened it with care. "My dear Miss Marple, how thrilling to hear from you after all these years. I do indeed know of Miss Cecilia Warren. She trained with us briefly 2 years ago, bright, clever, and gifted in mimicry. She left before completing her term, but not before I introduced her to a producer who admired her quiet intensity. She has since taken a few minor stage roles, nothing exceptional. She does, however, have a certain talent for impersonation and a gift for taking on emotional roles. If she's wandered into one of your village dramas, I'm sure she's left a ripple." Warmly, Evangeline Westbrook. Miss Marple smiled softly. "A ripple indeed." She spent the rest of the morning walking to the inn. Mr. Greenlow, the innkeeper, greeted her with visible relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, I was hoping someone would take an interest. That woman, Miss Withers, she called herself, booked under a false name, I'm sure of it. Quiet, well-spoken, didn't take any meals, always out at night. Disappeared without paying. Did she speak to anyone?" Miss Marple asked. "Not really, though she did ask after one thing that struck me. Yes, she wanted to know if there was a place in the village where old love letters were kept. Said she was researching something literary. I told her the vicar kept some parish records, but that if she was after real correspondence, she'd best try the village museum archives. That seemed to satisfy her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The museum was little more than a converted barn filled with spinning wheels and faded maps, but it did have a cabinet of donated letters, many of which were from the war years. She thanked Mr. Greenlow and made her way there, stopping only briefly at the baker's to buy a currant bun. Upon arriving, she greeted the museum's caretaker, Mr. Hilberry, a man with a quiet disposition and a fondness for naval history. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "You've come to see the parish maps?" "Not today, Mr. Hilberry," she said. "I wonder if anyone's looked through the old letter archives this past week." "Funny you ask," he replied. "A young lady came by. Polite, very careful, wore gloves, said she was studying how handwriting changes over time." "And did she take anything?" "Not that I saw, but she lingered over one particular letter from the Wrexham family. If I recall." Miss Marple followed his gesture to the small display cabinet. There, among the yellowed letters, was one envelope slightly askew. She asked permission to open the case. Inside, she found the letter addressed from C.W. to L.B., dated June 1939. She read it carefully. "Lionel, you say you want to make everything right, but you cannot mend something you were so eager to break. My mother says silence is protection. I shall leave this place. If you follow me, I will make public what you did. You gave me a ring. I left you a button. That's all either of us has earned." Miss Marple folded the letter with reverence. Outside, the mist had cleared and the sun lit the village in full clarity. But in her mind, the fog was thickening. She returned home to find Inspector Cray waiting at her gate, hat in hand. "I've had a call from Chipping Thatcham," he said. A young actress matching Cecilia Warren's description was spotted boarding a train. She was alone. Said she'd been in the area for a private performance. "A performance indeed," Miss Marple murmured. Cray exhaled. "But if she's just a pawn who was directing the scene?" Miss Marple looked out across the village rooftops. Somewhere, someone had pulled the strings. Someone had taken the memory of a vanished woman and used it as both mask and message, not merely to scare Lionel Blackwood, but to undo him entirely. She didn't kill him, Miss Marple said. She was meant to haunt him. Someone else finished the job. Cray narrowed his eyes. "You know who?" "Not yet," she said. "But I know who knew the right people, who could stage the deception, and who had the most to lose if Lionel Blackwood had uncovered that letter." "Then we're back to Amelia Wrexham." Miss Marple paused. "No, she loved her niece. She'd protect her, but she wouldn't orchestrate murder." Cray asked quietly, "Then who would?" Miss Marple glanced down at the velvet button in her hand, her fingers curling around it as if it held more than fabric. "The one who wanted to write the final scene," she said. "The one who had a reason to make sure the curtain came down permanently." Chapter 6. The Script Beneath the Silence. On Friday morning, St. Clement's Green felt strangely theatrical, as though every villager sensed they had entered the second act of a drama. Without knowing their lines, eyes lingered longer across the high street. Curtains moved more quickly when footsteps passed, and the usual morning routines, shopping, post, church bell ticked forward with unnatural rhythm. Miss Marple, seated on her garden bench, observed it all through the subtle twitch of netting on her parlor window. A second red button, nearly identical to the first, lay on the table beside her tea. It had arrived in an unmarked envelope that morning, slipped discreetly through her letterbox sometime between 6 and 7. No message. Just the button. It was meant to unsettle. It did not. She sipped her tea and considered it. Whoever had sent the button wished to escalate the story. A second symbol, a second ghostly touch. But why send it to her? Because, she thought, they know I am watching, and they want me to look in the wrong direction. By 10 o'clock, she had made her way to Amelia Wrexham's house. The iron gate creaked slightly as she passed through, and the faint scent of camellias still clung to the garden, though the blossoms themselves had turned brittle at the edges. Amelia opened the door with less hesitation than before. Her eyes looked clearer, though still guarded. "You've heard something," she said flatly. "Not quite," Miss Marple replied. "But I've received something." She held up the second velvet button, wrapped in a clean linen handkerchief. Amelia blinked. "That's not Cecily's," she said. "It's too fresh, indeed. And I think someone wants us to believe the ghost has returned again." Only this time, the ghost is speaking to me. They sat in the conservatory, sunlight warming the glass panes above their heads. Miss Marple placed both buttons on the small table, along with the program from the play and the unsigned envelope. "I've come to ask about your late husband," she said softly. Amelia froze. "Gerald." "Yes, he passed just 3 years after Cecily left. Did he not?" Amelia nodded. "Heart trouble, sudden. Was he close to Lionel?" "Not particularly. Cordial but distant. Gerald didn't like secrets, and Lionel was full of them." "Did he ever speak of Cecily's disappearance?" Amelia's mouth tightened. "He blamed himself, said he should have intervened. But Cecily was headstrong. She'd made her decision, and after Gerald died." Miss Marple pressed. "Did Lionel contact you?" A pause. "Yes," Amelia said at last. "Once, he sent a letter. Said he wanted to visit, to explain. Did you respond?" "No, I couldn't bear it." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts quietly shifting. "There was a second person who stood between Cecily and Lionel," she said. "Someone not bound by blood. Someone with access to both their lives, but without the constraints of family." Amelia looked puzzled. "Who?" Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a photograph she had quietly borrowed from the parish archive, a garden party from 1938. It was grainy, but faces were visible. At the center stood Cecily, a book in one hand, her arm linked not with Lionel Blackwood, but with another familiar figure. "Do you recognize her?" Miss Marple asked. Amelia leaned in. "That's Isabel Ardingly. She taught Cecily in the village school. Poetry, I think." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but precise. "And Isabel never married, never left St. Clement's Green, never quite relinquished the habit of correcting people's thoughts." Amelia frowned. "You can't think." "I don't yet know what I think," Miss Marple interrupted quietly. "But Miss Ardingly found the body, and when people find things too easily, it's often because they know where to look." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the schoolhouse, now converted into a local history center. Miss Ardingly resided in the flat above, a space of lace curtains and heavy oak furniture. She welcomed Miss Marple with cordial tightness. "Do sit," she said, gesturing to an armchair as stiff as her smile. "I do hope this isn't about the fate. I've already told the inspector all I know." "Oh no," Miss Marple said. "I've come about poetry." Isabel blinked. "Cecily Wrexham's poetry, to be precise." "I understand you taught her." "I did," Isabel said carefully. "She was talented, thoughtful, troubled. You were fond of her." "Of course. She shared her writing with you?" "Yes, in confidence." Miss Marple studied the woman's hands. They were clasped tightly, the skin white at the knuckles. "Did she ever speak to you about Lionel Blackwood?" A silence. "She asked me whether people change," Isabel said slowly. "I told her they only pretend to, and when she disappeared, she sent me one final note," Isabel replied, rising suddenly and crossing to a bureau. She withdrew a small envelope and handed it to Miss Marple. The handwriting was unmistakably Cecily's. "Dearest Miss Ardingly, you always told me to read the truth between the lines. I'm going where I can write my own. Thank you for protecting my thoughts. If I return, it will be in verse. C. Miss Marple folded the letter with great care. "She trusted you," she said. Isobel's eyes gleamed. "She was the daughter I never had. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you never went looking for her." Isobel's face hardened. "She didn't want to be found." Miss Marple stood. "Unless someone needed her found, decades later, for their own purpose." There was no response. But as Miss Marple turned to leave, she noticed something on the writing desk, a sealed envelope addressed in familiar ink. She did not mention it, but she noted the initials on the blotter beside it, "L.B. later." As the evening light waned over the village green, Miss Marple returned home to find Inspector Cray waiting for her with visible agitation. "She's gone," He said, "Who?" Isabel ardingly. Packed a bag, left a note for her neighbor. Said she was going to Bath. No forwarding address. Miss Marple took it calmly. Then we must move quickly. I've already put out a trace. I don't think she'll run far. Miss Marple said. She believes she's right. People who believe that rarely flee entirely. What was her motive? She loved Cecily, Miss Marple said. But more than that, she hated Lionel. Hated what he did. And when he returned, sniffing about the past, threatening the silence she had kept for Cecily's sake, she snapped. No, Miss Marple said. She planned, carefully, the impersonation, the actress, the button she designed the theater. But someone else changed the ending. Cray's brow furrowed. Another player? Yes, Miss Marple said. Someone close enough to both Lionel and Isabel. Someone who saw the illusion for what it was and decided to use it for their own end. Who? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I need one more piece, she said. And I think it's waiting in the church vestry. Cray gave her a long look. You're going to finish this. I intend to, she said. Before anyone else writes another scene, she turned back toward the lane, her parasol tapping gently on the stones, the red velvet button in her pocket like a punctuation mark waiting for its sentence. Chapter 7. The vestry ledger. It was early Saturday morning, and the sky hung low over St. Clement's Green, the clouds resting like cotton on the church spire. The rain, light but persistent, gave the village an odd hush, quiet enough for footsteps to echo in cobbled lanes, and the metallic squeak of a garden gate to sound like a bell. Miss Marple walked with purpose, gloved hands tucked neatly round the carved handle of her parasol. Though her pace was gentle, her thoughts were anything but. The path to the vestry at St. Clement's Church was one she had walked hundreds of times, over the years, at weddings, at funerals, at choir practices, but never before with the weight of a murder pressing behind each step. Reverend Puckle met her at the side door with a puzzled smile. Miss Marple, I must say, you're up early today. Forgive the intrusion. Vicar, she said kindly, but I wonder if I might take a brief look at the parish ledgers, the ones kept in the vestry safe? He blinked. The old ledgers? Why, certainly, though they're mostly filled with marriage bans and dull estate notices. Precisely, she replied. He unlocked the vestry and led her inside. The small room smelled of brass polish and hymnals, and its stone walls held the kind of chill that never quite lifted, even in summer. A large wooden cabinet stood against the far wall, and from it the vicar retrieved a dusty, iron-clasped book. Miss Marple took the ledger and turned its pages slowly, fingers brushing entries decades old. Baptisms, deaths, marriages, Wrexham, Blackwood, Ardingly, each name now shadowed by implication. Then, on a page dated September 1939, her fingers paused, a note written not in the vicar's hand, but added in tight, neat script beside a marriage entry that never occurred. L. Blackwood. Banns posted 3 Sundays. Wedding cancelled. Bride absent. A secondary note. Almost an afterthought. Visitation from relative. Refused access to vestry records. Request denied. Initialed G.W. Gerald Wrexham. Cecily's uncle. Amelia's late husband. Miss Marple read the notation again, and a breath passed between her lips like the lifting of a veil. Someone had come searching, even then, and Gerald had turned them away, protecting a secret that even now cast a long shadow. Vicar, she asked without turning, was there ever a woman perhaps in the early 1940s who visited the vestry under false pretense? Reverend Puckle scratched his head. I wouldn't know. That was before my time. But I recall something odd in the correspondence drawer. He fetched a smaller ledger, letters addressed to the church over the decades. He flipped to a folder marked 1940 to 1949 and drew out a thin envelope. The handwriting on the front was delicate, careful. It read, "To whom it may concern, Vestry inquiry regarding Miss C.W. Inside was a short letter. I am writing as one who loved her once, who cannot believe she vanished without cause. If records exist of marriage, of travel, of death, I beg you to share them. There are debts not yet paid, and I fear my silence has cost too much. L.B. Miss Marple stared at the signature. Lionel Blackwood, she murmured. He searched for her even then. The vicar cleared his throat. The request was denied, apparently by Mr. Wrexham himself. The matter was deemed sensitive. She handed the letter back. I believe it still is. An hour later, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray at the station, the rain tapping softly against the glass behind him. She laid out the findings with the precision of a surgeon. The second red button was meant to scare me, she said. To suggest Cecily's return was no longer theater but fact. But the timing, it came only after I visited Amelia and Isabel. Someone grew nervous. Cray folded his arms. Isabel Ardingly's departure was convenient. Too convenient, Miss Marple replied. She constructed the illusion, the staged haunting of Lionel Blackwood. But someone else turned her illusion into murder. Cray frowned. And who had the motive? Someone who knew of Lionel's past cruelty. Someone who believed they were protecting Cecily's memory. Cray tapped his pen. That could be Amelia. No, Miss Marple said. Amelia buried the truth for Cecily. But she would never stage a deception. Then who? Miss Marple opened her handbag and pulled out a photograph from the garden party, the same one she'd shown Amelia. This time, she pointed to a figure on the far left. A woman, unsmiling, watchful. Do you recognize her? Cray leaned in. That's Mrs. Hartnell, the postmistress. She has access to everyone's letters, everyone's movements. She's the village switchboard by necessity and by temperament. You think she's involved? Miss Marple nodded. She saw Lionel return. She saw Isabel begin her little play with the actress. And she decided to ensure it ended not with public embarrassment but with death. Cray stared at the photo. She knew Cecily well enough. They were in the same reading circle. She once said Cecily's poetry was too soft for this world. I think she blamed Lionel for making it so. But murder? Some people do not kill in rage, Miss Marple said. They kill to rewrite endings. Mrs. Hartnell is orderly. She does not like messy history. Lionel, returning with talk of lost documents and unsaid truths, he threatened that. Cray stood. Then we confront her. Not yet, Miss Marple said. She won't break under pressure. But I think she's been preparing for this moment. And I think she's watching, still deciding how the third act should end. Later that day, Miss Marple stopped by the post office. Mrs. Hartnell greeted her as usual, standing behind the counter with folded hands and a stiff smile. Afternoon, Miss Marple. Bit wet out today. Quite so, said Miss Marple, removing her gloves. I've come to post a letter. She handed over a sealed envelope. Mrs. Hartnell weighed it, stamped it, and placed it in the outgoing tray. Off to London, is it? Yes, Miss Marple said. To the theater. I've asked the young actress, Miss Warren, to return. Mrs. Hartnell's hand paused mid-motion. Oh, she said slowly. I thought she'd left the stage. So did I, Miss Marple said with a smile. But sometimes, the best performances are saved for the encore. She collected her purse and left the shop, never once looking back. Behind the counter, Mrs. Hartnell stood very still, outside. The sky remained heavy with rain, and the village resumed its hush. But within that quiet, a decision had shifted. The final curtain was drawing near. Chapter 8. The final rehearsal be Sunday. The village of St. Clement's Green seemed to breathe through clenched teeth. The clouds had not lifted. The church bells rang at 11:15 with their usual solemnity. But even their echoes seemed cautious, hesitant to stir what now hung unspoken over the tidy hedgerows and lace-curtained cottages. At the post office, Mrs. Hartnell was uncharacteristically absent. A handwritten note on the door read, Closed for the day. Apologies. No one questioned it aloud, but several people exchanged looks as they passed, some whispering, others simply turning their heads a little faster than usual. Miss Marple was not at church that morning, nor at home. She was seated in the back pew of the parish hall, where the local amateur theater troupe had begun preparations for their midsummer play, a light-hearted comedy titled A Case of Custard. Rehearsals had been postponed since the murder, but Miss Marple knew human nature. Life would always try to resume its rhythms, especially when secrets threatened to overwhelm the silence. She had come not for the play, but for its players. At precisely noon, a small figure entered from the hall's side door. She wore a beige raincoat and sunglasses too large for her face, but Miss Marple recognized the way she moved, the slight hesitation, the careful placement of her steps. "Miss Warren," she called gently. The girl paused, then removed the glasses. Her face was pale, slightly drawn from travel, but her eyes still held the stage-trained awareness Miss Marple expected. She walked slowly to the back pew and sat beside her, folding her hands in her lap. "I was told I might be needed," she said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you for coming. I promise you it's not for the theater." The girl gave a faint smile. "So I gathered." For a moment, the hall was silent, but for the creaking of rafters and the ticking of the dusty wall clock. "You were paid," Miss Marple began, "to impersonate someone long presumed gone. You were given Cecily's letters, her poetry, and a button." Miss Warren's lips tightened. "I didn't know who she was, only that it was meant to unsettle a man. I thought it was some kind of immersive performance, experimental." "Did Isabel Ardingly ever speak of vengeance?" "No," the girl replied quickly. "She said it was a reckoning. She said truth needed theater, and that guilt required a stage." Miss Marple considered that. She staged the illusion. But did she ever mention another player? Someone who gave her Cecily's letters? The girl hesitated. "There was a woman," she said at last, "older than Ardingly. Visited only once. I didn't get her name. She brought a small parcel. Said it was Cecily's handwriting, that it had to look real, and that Lionel Blackwood would recognize the scent. Lavender and lilac," she whispered. "She gave me a perfume bottle and said to dab it behind my ears and on my gloves." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. The final piece was almost in reach. Back at the station, Inspector Cray sat with his boots propped on the low cabinet, staring at the corkboard now thick with photos, letters, maps, and fragments of red velvet. Constable Timms entered with 2 cups of tea. "I spoke to the florist," he said, "about the perfume. Turns out Mrs. Hartnell ordered a small bottle of lavender lilac oil just 3 weeks ago. Said it was for migraines." Cray took the cup. "And that proves what?" "She doesn't suffer migraines," Timms said. "I asked Dr. Latham. He's treated her for years. Never once prescribed a thing for her head." Cray sat upright. "Then she staged the scent." Timms nodded. "And she knew when to use it." Cray tapped the photo of Lionel Blackwood on the board. "He came here digging into Cecily's disappearance," he said. "Mrs. Hartnell saw the trouble, saw Isabel playing games with ghosts, and decided to finish the matter permanently. She planted the second button to push Miss Marple off course," Timms added. "But she didn't realize she was drawing her in deeper." Cray stood. "Let's bring her in." But they were too late. Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Hartnell's cottage just minutes after the police. The door was unlocked, but the windows had all been latched from the inside. It was Reverend Puckle who found her seated in her armchair, a blanket drawn over her knees. The scent of lavender still faint in the air. "She's not dead," the doctor confirmed moments later. "Sleeping. Drugged herself." Inspector Cray stood over her, jaw tight. "A suicide attempt." Miss Marple, who had remained silent until now, moved closer to the writing desk beside the armchair. There, propped carefully against a teacup, was an envelope addressed in the same hand that had delivered the second button. To the one who saw past the curtain, Miss Marple opened it, her eyes scanning the brief message. You were right. The stage was hers, but the final lines were mine. He hurt too many, Cecily, Isabel, even me, in ways he never knew. I told him to meet me by the roses. I gave him one last chance to confess. He laughed. I had brought a paperweight from the post-counter glass and heavy. It only took one strike. It didn't feel like murder. It felt like silence, finally restored. M.H. Cray looked stunned. She lured him there. She knew his schedule, Miss Marple said. She saw him return to the past, knew he'd follow the ghost, and when he didn't repent. She took the ending into her own hands. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic tick of the carriage clock on the mantel. Cray sighed. Will she live? Dr. Latham answered from the doorway. Yes, the dose wasn't lethal, but she'll be drowsy for a day or two. Cray glanced at Miss Marple. And what do we do now? She folded the note carefully. We let her rest. Then we let the law speak. But gently, Inspector. Not all murders come from malice. Some rise from the long silence of pain. As the constables moved quietly through the house, gathering evidence, Miss Marple stepped outside into the soft rain. The village lay still. The fog that had hung for days now began to lift, revealing the soft outlines of chimneys and rooftops beneath. She paused at her garden gate, the red velvet button still in her pocket. Not a clue now, not even a weapon, just a symbol, a reminder that sometimes justice wears no badge, and that in a village like St. Clement's Green, even silence must be listened to. Chapter 9. Ashes beneath the hearth. Following afternoon, St. Clement's Green was washed clean by rain and oddly subdued, as if the village itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Church bells rang faintly in the distance, but no one really listened. For once, there was nothing left to speculate, and nothing left to whisper. The truth had come out, not in a grand confrontation or a courtroom drama, but quietly, like a confession spoken to the garden wind. Miss Marple sat beside the fireplace in her parlor, a fresh tray of scones untouched on the table. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, the needles paused mid-loop. Across from her, Inspector Cray stood without his usual stiffness, arms folded and head bowed slightly. She's confessed in full, he said. We have it on paper, and the physical evidence matches. His blood was found on the base of that paperweight. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. Mabel Hartnell was never the type to shout, but she always believed in correction. She saw Lionel Blackwood's return as an error to be erased. She knew about Cecily. Cray asked. She suspected. More than most, said Miss Marple softly. She read every letter in this village before it reached its addressee, Inspector. Not illegally, of course, but one does pick things up when handling envelopes. Paperweight ink, foreign stamps, the scent of desperation. Cray sighed. So she followed Isabel Ardingley's charade, let it play out. And when Blackwood didn't show remorse, she decided he didn't deserve another act. Miss Marple finished. Cray looked down. She'll be charged. There's no way around it. I don't doubt that. But I do hope the courts remember that some crimes begin with kindness. Twisted kindness, perhaps, but not hatred. There was a long pause. Outside, the wind pushed against the window panes like an old friend trying to come in. Did Cecily ever return? Cray asked at last. Miss Marple reached for the teapot and poured a cup, steam curling between them. I believe she lived, she said, somewhere far from here. A quiet life. But I think she's gone now. Cray looked puzzled. How do you know? Miss Marple's eyes dropped to the fire. Because ghosts only return when the living start speaking for them, she said. And in this case, they spoke too loudly. They sat in silence a while longer. Two minds, one weary with justice, the other heavy with memory. At dusk, after Cray had left and the lamplight turned the room to amber, Miss Marple opened a drawer in her writing desk. From it, she drew the two red velvet buttons, still wrapped in their respective cloths. She placed them side by side on the mantel. Not evidence now, not proof, just remnants, tokens of a village that had, for a moment, become a stage. Then, one by one, she dropped them into the small hearth fire. The fabric hissed as it curled into ash, and when the flames quieted, she leaned back in her chair and resumed her knitting small, steady movements, like the world had never unraveled at all. Chapter 10. What the Roses Remembered. A week had passed since the truth had settled over St. Clement's Green, like the last leaf of autumn, unavoidable, soundless and strangely weightless. Life, in its usual English manner, continued. The milk deliveries resumed, the baker's bell rang precisely at 6:30, and Sunday church saw a quiet but steady gathering of villagers, each politely avoiding the weightier topic that lingered between the hymns and the closing prayer. Miss Marple did not return to the fete committee, nor did she make any fuss about it. Instead, she spent her days as she always had, tending to her hydrangeas, writing short notes to distant nieces, and observing with the quiet patience of someone who knew that time eventually told all truths one way or another. But one morning, as the light crept through the lace curtains and golden slats, a small brown envelope arrived. It was unremarkable. Save for the handwriting, delicate, firm, and unfamiliar, she opened it over her breakfast tray. Miss Marple, I do not know what you saw or how much you understood, but I owe you something. Not an apology, not even thanks, but a page from the story I never meant to be written. I was never meant to return. I lived quietly in Florence under another name, writing small things, nothing of merit. I had no interest in revenge, only in forgetting. But when I heard he had returned to the village, asking questions, I knew someone else might try to tell my story for me, and I couldn't bear that. So I wrote to someone I trusted once, Isabel, and asked her to help remind Lionel who he truly was. It wasn't meant to lead to his death. It was meant to force him to reckon with what he did. But perhaps reckoning always invites something darker. I didn't kill him, but I'm not sorry he's gone. Please burn this. I've made my peace. C. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and set it beside her teacup. She did not burn it. Not yet. The puzzle was complete now, not with a sudden revelation, but like a tapestry that had quietly revealed its pattern with time. Cecily had returned not in person, but in story. She had handed the mask to others, Isabel, the actress, even Mabel Hartnell, in doing so, had allowed her truth to speak without ever uttering a word aloud. And that, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the most devastating kind of justice. Later that day, she walked slowly to the vicarage garden. The fate bunting had long been removed, but the rose trellis still stood, heavy with late summer blooms. She paused beneath it, glancing to the place where Lionel Blackwood had found where old secrets had broken through the soil like roots long thought dead. The roses were particularly red that year. She knelt, gently brushing aside a trailing vine. There, nestled among the thorns, was a small stone plaque, newly placed, unmarked by moss. No name, just a line etched in soft script. Where silence grew, truth bloomed. She recognized the hand that carved it. Reverend Puckle, perhaps, or someone else who understood that not all graves are marked by crosses. As she stood, she heard footsteps approach. It was Amelia Wrexham. You came, the widow said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. It seemed right. Amelia looked toward the plaque. He never knew how much harm he'd done, to Cecily, to all of us. He knew enough to be afraid, Miss Marple said. That's why he came back. He wanted to erase the damage or explain it away. But memory is rarely as forgiving as people hope. Amelia lowered her eyes. And Cecily, she lives, Miss Marple replied. But I don't think she'll ever come back. "Not here, no," Amelia whispered. Too much was buried. They stood in silence together beneath the rose arch, neither speaking, both remembering, when Amelia left. Miss Marple lingered a little longer, her eyes drifting once more to the unmarked plaque. Then she turned and walked home. At her cottage, she opened the letter once more. Read it a final time, and this time she did burn it. She placed it gently into the firebox, and as the edges curled into ash, she felt no triumph, only stillness. That evening, over a modest supper, she resumed her knitting and allowed her mind to drift back not to the crime, but to the quiet courage of those who'd endured its shadow. She thought of Cecily's poetry, of Isobel's performance, of Mabel Hartnell's bitter righteousness, and of Lionel Blackwood, who had imagined he could return to rewrite his past, but had misjudged the village's memory. In the end, justice had not come from a courtroom, nor from the gallows. It had come from a rose path, from a button, from the whispered warnings of women who remembered what men forgot. She glanced to the hearth, where the buttons had turned to dust. Some stories were meant to vanish. Others, she knew, would bloom again somewhere else, under other names, in quieter gardens. And as Miss Marple reached the end of her row of stitches, she smiled faintly, already thinking of the next story waiting to unfold.